Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud, or stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 286, and it's titled, When the Puritans Were in Power, written by H.M. Titchener, copyright 1921. So this Little Blue Book is 105 years, or 104 years old. And it is showing its age. It is falling apart. Every page is fallen out. So, here we go. The witch craze starts in New England. With the exception of John Calvin, Protestantism never produced a holier maniac than Cotton Mather. He was as religiously credulous as he was religiously cruel, and as religiously cruel as he was religiously credulous. The description that Ingersoll applied to John Calvin also applied to Cotton Mather. He was as near like the God of the Old Testament as his health permitted. Cotton Mather went through life with the fear of God and dread of Satan. In his religious delirium, he saw things: witches riding through the skies at midnight astride broomsticks, unbaptized infants tossed by imps with pitchforks into a burning pit. He said, "No place that I know of has got such a spell upon it as will always keep the devil out. Only when we come to heaven, we shall be out of his reach forever." He wrote a book on the wonders of the invisible world. One of the wonders was a graphic account of babies less than a span in length suffering in hell. His God even damned miscarriages. Another was the joy expressed on the faces of the saved as they leaned over the jasper walls of heaven and viewed the awful agony of the lost. Such a wonderful place. Cotton Mather saw these things. Faith in things divinely inspired had driven from his soul every spark of humanity, from his brain every particle of reason. He delivered his delusions from the pulpit, and the people believed them. Then started in New England a witch craze that forms one of the most brutal chapters in the brutal history of Orthodox religion. The first victim recorded of the inspired injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Exodus, was a woman named Margaret Jones. The evidence offered that convicted and condemned her as a witch is preserved in the journal of John Winthrop, governor of the colony at the time, and who presided at the trial. He states that she was found to have such a malignant touch as many persons, men, women, and children, whom she stroked or touched with any affliction or displeasure, were taken with deafness or vomiting or other violent pains or sickness. He further says that in the prison there was seen in her arms a little child, which ran from her into another room, and the officer following it vanished. The condition of Governor Winthrop's brain is disclosed in his declaration that some day and hour she was executed. There was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees. Jehovah was endeavoring to blow Satan out of New England, as he once drove him over the ramparts of heaven. In Witchcraft in Salem Village, Winfield S. Nevins tells the story as found in Everett's Anecdotes of Early Local History. Shortly after the execution of Margaret Jones, her husband endeavored to secure passage into Barbados in a vessel then lying in Boston Harbor, with 180 tons of ballast and 80 horses on board. He was refused passage because he was the husband of a witch, and it was immediately observed that the vessel began to roll as if it would turn over. This strange action was alleged to be caused by Jones. The magistrates, being notified, issued their warrants for his arrest. As the officers going to serve the warrant was crossing the ferry, the vessel continued to roll. He remarked that he had that which would tame the vessel and keep it quiet, at the same time exhibiting the document. Instantly, the vessel ceased to roll, after having been in motion 12 hours. Jones was arrested and thrown into prison, and the vessel rolled no more. The reader will note the similarity of the Jones story as recorded in the Bible. If the authorities had allowed Jones to have sailed in the vessel bound for the Barbados, who knows but that Jehovah might have influenced the sailors to throw him overboard in Boston Bay, where he had prepared an enormous codfish to swallow him. As it was, Jones finally escaped from the authorities. They hunted the word of God in vain to find some passage ordering what disposition should be made of the widower of a witch. Whether the Lord had purposely left out such an injunction, leaving it to the judgment of his people, or whether he had carelessly overlooked the matter, or whether in ancient times witches did not marry, the doctors of divinity could not decide. The best they could do in the case was to set aside a day of prayer. We are told that the general court, pondering over the matter, appointed a day of humiliation to ask God's mercy on account of the extent to which Satan prevails amongst us in respect of witchcraft. With the Puritans, as was the case with the ancient Bible-following Jews, the male servants of Satan usually fared better than the females. Jehovah seems partial to the men. However, in the case of Quakers, this rule did not apply. These were imprisoned, whipped, and hanged regardless of sex. As there was no Quakers in early Bible times, no laws were made regarding them, so the Puritans acted as they judged Jehovah would recommend, if he were inspiring a book at the time when Quakers were becoming numerous. The next recorded case of witch hanging, there were doubtless other hangings of which the record is lost, was that of Anne Hibbins, a widow living in Boston. Her husband, at one time, was quite well off, but had met with reverses and was penniless when he died. His death, together with her poverty and the neighbors, caused the widow to become crabbed and meddlesome. Poverty is not generally conclusive to prompting happy dispositions. She even disclosed a rebellious spirit against the afflictions, in the eyes of the more fortunate Puritans, were for the purpose of trying her faith. Well-to-do people are apt to see things in this light. It's quite common for those who do not enjoy them to preach the blessings of poverty to the ones blessed with it. Finally, the church reprimanded Anne Hibbins for complaining of her lot, and as that did not appear to do any good, she was accused, in the latter part of the year 1655, of being a witch. Was it not evident that Satan had control of her? Else why should she rebel against her poverty and misery? Does not God ordain who shall be masters and who shall be servants? And does he not condemn that servants shall be humble and servile to their masters? And was not Anne Hibbins in the servants class, since the Lord had taken away her husband in a bankrupt condition? And does not St. Paul declare that rebellious subjects shall be damned in hell? Therefore, according to the Scriptures and the everlasting procession of the saints, who are here to tell us what to think and what to speak and what to drink, and what plays to attend and the holy days to keep, was it not the duty as well as the privilege for the Lord's people to send Anne Hibbins to hell as expeditiously as possible? So this poor widow, according to Bible instructions, was hauled into a court composed of believers, and was found guilty of being a witch. The devil himself could not save her in a community 99% Orthodox. Therefore, the governor of Massachusetts pronounced the sentence, and Anne Hibbins was hanged. A remarkable case is that of Miss Greensmith, who confessed that she had committed adultery with Satan, as she was undoubtedly of weak mind, and as her husband was a gloomy Puritan. It may have been a case of mistaken identity on her part. In 1671, Elizabeth Knapp of Groton, Massachusetts, was convicted of witchcraft. She was doubtless insane, and as all insane persons, according to the New Testament, are possessed of the devil, or even at times of legions of devils, there could be no question as to Elizabeth Knapp's guilt. The account of the case, as told by Reverend Samuel Willard and recorded in Puritans' Witchcraft Explained, leaves no doubt regarding Elizabeth Knapp's mental condition. The cause of her insanity is not mentioned, but here was enough Orthodox religion rampant at the time to turn many a head. In the testimony of Reverend Willard, we read, Elizabeth was at first subject to mental moods and violent physical actions. Strange sudden shrieks, strange changes of countenance appeared, followed by the exclamations, "Oh, my leg!" which she would rub. "Oh, my breast!" and she would rub that. Afterwards came fits in which she would cry out, "Money, money!" offered her as inducements to yield obedience, and sometimes sin and misery as threats of punishment for refusal to obey the wishes of her strange visitant. Subsequently, she barked like a dog and bleated like a calf. Then she told Mr. Willard that was a rogue. Some voice said to her, "I am not Satan. I am a pretty black boy. You are my pretty girl." She charged Willard and some others of her parish with being her tormentors. It appears, according to the testimony of the Puritans, that Satan at one time tried to make Roman Catholics of them. Whether this was to make them worse than they were or better would be difficult for an impartial student of church history to determine. It would not seem possible, however, to have made them any worse. We read that a Mrs. Glover, who was convicted and hung as a witch in 1668, was not only a Roman Catholic, but also a wild Irish woman of bad character. To the Puritans, everybody was wild except themselves. This Mrs. Glover worked for a Puritan family that lived in Boston by the name of Goodwin. The Goodwins had a number of children who, having been mentally nourished on Cotton Mather's milk for babe, were naturally of weak mind. We are told that Mrs. Glover talked harshly, perhaps profanely, to the children. This threw one of them, Martha, into fits. The other children soon followed Martha's example, and they too had fits. From Puritanism to fits was not far to go. From that time on, Satan, working through the Irish Catholic woman, Mrs. Glover, had such control over the Goodwin children that they would fall into spasms at the sight of the Assembly's Catechism, Cotton Mather's Milk for Babes, and other like literature. From having spasms over the Catechism and the Milk for Babes, the Goodwin children began to have attacks of being deaf or dumb or blind, and sometimes all these disorders together would come upon them. They also exhibited other evidences of witchcraft. Their tongues would be drawn down their throats, then pulled out upon their chins. In this way, they disclosed a disrespect of the gospel of infant damnation. On the other hand, we are told that they could read Popish and Quaker books without any difficulties. This was evidence enough to convict and hang the wild Irish woman of bad character. In the year 1692, the Reverend Samuel Parrish was pastor of the Church of Salem. Reverend Parrish firmly believed in witchcraft. He also believed in slavery and was an owner of slaves. He was as orthodox as religion could make him. Before coming to Massachusetts, the Reverend Parrish had lived in the West Indies, where he preached Puritanism to the natives. Among his household chattels, there had been brought with him to Salem was a female slave, half Negro and half native West Indian, by the name of Tituba. The Puritans, following divine instructions as found in the 25th chapter of Leviticus, verse 44, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you, were, whenever possible, enslaving the Indians. To them, America was the promised land that Jehovah had specifically prepared for their use, and among these useful things were heathen, to be seized as slaves. But Satan, it appears, had filled the hearts of the Indians with rebellion against biblical laws. They were devils, declared Cotton Mathers, the children of Satan. From an orthodox view, he had reason to hate them. Negro slaves had been made quite contented with hallelujah hymns of a sweet by and by, but the Indians somehow failed to appreciate such attraction. And so it sometimes happened that when a husky young Indian had been captured, and the Bible laws regarding slavery duly read to him, that instead of imbuing him with St. Paul's gospel of servility to divinely ordained masters, it filled his heathen heart with revolt, and in place of waiting for sunrise to go to work hoeing corn, he would stealthily arise in the still hours of night, go to the woodpile, and arm himself with an axe, and finding his way to his master's bedside, hurry the pious creature to heaven before he had any idea going there. Then Satan's offspring, without bothering to consult any inspired book, would appropriate the best horse on the place and light out for his native wilds. Such occurrences as this had a tendency to discourage Indian slavery among the Puritans. No shit. All right, we'll stop there for a quick hydration break. This hydration break brought to you by my friend Maddie. Hydrate, Maddie. But to return to the Reverend Samuel Parrish and his bondmaid Tituba, it was in the home of this preacher that witchcraft was fanned into a raging fury in Salem. And the half-Negro Tituba, together with Elizabeth, the 9-year-old daughter of Parrish, and a niece who lived with him, Abigail Williams, 11 years of age, with a number of other children of the neighborhood, were the ones that started it. It is told that during the winter, these girls held occasional meetings in the winter. Oh, never mind. Occasional meetings in the neighborhood, usually at the minister's house. They began to act after a strange and unusual manner by getting into holes and creeping under chairs and stools, and to use sundry odd postures, which neither they themselves nor any others could make any sense of. Witchcraft in Salem Village. It is remarkable that children, reared in the atmosphere of gross superstition, where witchcraft was a common subject of conversation, should act in the manner described. Do we not read today of insane acts following a series of revival meetings? To further quote, this state of affairs, continuing from late in December until into February of 1692, the elder people learned something of what was transpiring in their midst. Great was their consternation. Dr. Griggs was called, but, as sometimes happens even in this day of great learning, the doctor did not know what ailed the young people. Their disease was one unknown to medical science. Evidently, feeling obliged to give some explanation of the disorder, the doctor declared the girls were possessed of the devil. In other words, bewitched. Thereupon, the curiosity of the whole community was awakened. People came from near and far to witness the strange antics of these children. Their credulity was taxed to the utmost. Mr. Parrish, as was natural, was not only an interested spectator, but he took charge of the whole business. He called a meeting of the ministers of the neighboring parishes to observe, to investigate, to pray. They came, they saw, they were conquered. The devil was now working overtime in Salem. Recognizing in the Puritans a people after Jehovah's own heart, he promised to do his utmost to destroy their faith. His aim was to eventually make a witch, or at least a Quaker, of every Puritan. Finally, we are told the preachers unanimously agreed with Dr. Griggs that the girls were bewitched. The all-important question was, who or what caused them to act as they did? Who bewitched them? Whose spirit did the devil take to afflict them? Mr. Perry and some of the ministers and prominent people in the village undertook to solve the mystery. Several private facts were held at the minister's house. Yeah, it's facts. Several private facts. And several more were held publicly. The children at first refused to tell anybody about the mysterious affair. Tituba proposed to know how to discover witches and tried some experiments with that end in view. With the assistance of her husband, also a slave belonging to Reverend Parrish, she mixed some meal with wine of the afflicted and made a cake. Tituba was probably versed in the voodoo faith of her African ancestors. In mysteries, in mysteries, this faith largely resembles Orthodox creeds. No sooner had the cake been fed to the children than they knew who the parties were that bewitched them. They became as wise as Ezekiel, who, says the Bible, saw things when he fed on a somewhat similar diet. The children charged two old women of the village, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, together with Tituba, with having bewitched them. The history of the period describes Sarah Good as a melancholy, distracted person, and Sarah Osborne as a bedridden old woman. It was no trouble for the Puritans to convict such as these. Sarah Good was tried and convicted of being a witch and was hanged on July 19, 1692. A prominent preacher, the Reverend Noyes, stood by the gallows and said to the victim, "You are a witch, and you know you are a witch." "You are a liar, and you know you are a liar," replied Sarah Good. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Sarah Osborne was dragged from her bed and thrown into jail. It was more than her old feeble body could stand, and she died before the saints could convict and hang her. Tituba was also put in jail. Economic determinism, however, saved her life. Being a slave, she owned no property, which according to the law of the times went to the informers and officials. But being a slave and in good health, she was worth money. There were informers and witnesses' fees, the cost of court and jail officials, and other incidental expenses to be paid, and they all needed the money. So Tituba was sold to the highest bidder, and the proceeds pocketed by the parties mentioned. Then began a roundup of witches that crowded the jails. Governor Phipps of Massachusetts, hurrying to Boston, found the jails filled with persons accused of witchcraft. He immediately appointed a court of oyer and terminer to try them. William Stockton, deputy governor, presided as judge. Having been educated for the Puritan ministry, there was no question regarding his fitness as judge in witch trials. Preliminary examinations were held in the churches. How many were hung and in what various localities, we do not know. Only the record of some of the cases has been preserved. Gallows Hill, between Salem and Peabody, claims a majority of the hangings. A letter written in Salem, dated November 25th, 1791, by the Reverend Dr. Holyoke, contains the following information. In the last month, there died a man in this town by the name of John Simmons, aged 100 years, lacking about 6 months, having been born in the famous 92. He has told me that his nurse had often told him that while she was attending his mother at the time she lay in with him, she saw from the chamber windows those unhappy people hanging on Gallows Hill, who were executed for witches by the delusion of the times. The court appointed by Governor Phipps sat for the first time at Salem in June of 1692. There are no complete records of the trials and convictions to be found. They were evidently too busy convicting and hanging witches to keep all of the proceedings. Governor Hutchinson, in his History of Massachusetts, speaks of 6 witches who were tried and convicted in one day. Church apologists, unable to deny the cases recorded, try to minimize the number hung. After the hanging of Sarah Good and the death in jail of Sarah Osborne, the next recorded case is that of Bridget Bishop. Her trial was held during the first week in June 1692. She was convicted and hanged on June 10th. Her Irish name alone would seem enough to condemn her in the sight of Protestants, both dead and some still living. The judges and juries looked to the preachers for advice, and so the court requested divine assistance from the church. The Reverend Cotton Mather was chosen to conduct special services. He delivered a sermon in which he said, "We judge that in the prosecution of these and all such witchcrafts, they're in need of a very critical and exquisite caution, lest by too many crudelities for things received only up on the devil's authority, there be a door opened for a long train of miserable consequences, and Satan get an advantage over us. For we should not be ignorant of his devices." Further on, this divine declared that it is an undoubted and notorious thing that a demon may, by God's permission, appear even to ill purposes in the shape of an innocent, yea, and a virtuous man. From this, it would seem that Jehovah permits Satan, even helps him, as is recorded in the Bible's story of Job, to perform his sorceries so that he, Jehovah, may enjoy seeing the victims suffer. In conclusion, Cotton Mather recommended the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious according to the directions given in the laws of God, and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the detection of witchcrafts. After prayerfully considering these instructions, the court got busy. According to records still extant, it convicted as witches Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, Susan Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Good, already referred to. These, in compliance with the inspired injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," were hanged on Tuesday, July 19th, 1692. The court then adjourned until the first week in August. Then it tried and convicted the following persons: Martha Carrier, accused of witchcraft; John Willard; George Jacobs; John Proctor; and the Reverend George Burroughs. They, together with Martha Carrier, were hanged on August 19th of 1692. And I think we'll stop there. This is the end of part 2 of Little Blue Book number 286, titled "When the Puritans Were in Power," by H.M. Titchener. Good times. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.